excellent question. I like that. That was really fun.
Yeah.
Let's get into
Yeah.
into the financial aspect, which we want
Yeah.
to critique here. So the go back a show ago for us to get into detail here, but the overview, as I understand it, is first with, and I'm going to zoom in on the U.S. here, first with the United States baby boomers now entering retirement. They're going to be taking most of their stocks, bonds, or stocks and risky portfolios and moving them into safer things like bonds and cash because they're no longer earning an income and they can't handle the volatility, which is totally normal. And normally this doesn't do much to the economy except the fact that the baby boomer generation is the biggest generation that has ever hit the earth, and it's all happening at the same time. And the fallout from that essentially is a very, very large increase in the cost of capital and a very, very large increase in the cost of labor because these very experienced, this very experienced generation in terms of their job skills is leaving the workforce, right? And there's
Just to be clear, we're primarily talking about non-US demographics right now.
well, even with the U.S., the baby boomer bubble
The
is
US
is
too,
bigger than the replacement.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That,
But yeah, we'll get to the these minutiae. So the
So what and then Nima's been reading more and more of the book, and he's gotten to the financial aspect.
Finance.
So
Yeah,
give
far,
us the financial aspect from the book.
So far we have discussed the origins of society. I mean, so far we've discussed in this book. Section 1 is about how the modern world was created, basically how it all began, the geographies of success. Section 2 is about transport and how transport on very big ships has enabled this incredibly cheap global transport to the point where the price of a product, something like 50 to 70% of it used to be made up by the shipping cost, to where now it's like a 0.5% or 0.1% or something like that, because you can put so much stuff into containers and can put so many containers onto a giant container ship that per product the transportation costs has come down significantly. So, and of course now the problem with that is that if we're not patrolling the oceans anymore, this will all become much more difficult, and the costs will go up, insurance costs will go up. A lot of people are just not going to do that kind of shipping anymore, he says. So he actually predicts that shipping will be conducted on smaller and smaller ships over time, not on these giant tankers. So then the next part that I got into is finance. That's the next section of his book. He starts by discussing the history of money. So he talks about how different countries in Mesopotamia, in the Mesopotamian era, would barter with each other for international trade, basically. So one of them could provide some good, the other some other good, copper and barley and whatnot. Was this Bronze Age, or when is it Bronze Age?
Yeah, this is Bronze Age. Bronze Age is like
I think it
3000
ends
BC.
in 1200 BC or something.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he talks about how during the Mesopotamian civilization and what we've called in our discussions the age of the agrarian empires, they established something called the barley standard, where barley became a big medium of international trade. And then the shekel became a currency based on barley. So the shekel became an international currency, international to that region, of course, that you could redeem against barley. And that has sort of harmonized and allowed for some trade in that region to some extent. This is not counter to MMT, because MMT does not deny that barter did happen on an international scale from country to country. One country produces something, another is better at something else. They come to an agreement to
Well, and then there's
exchange.
still going to be an accounting unit between the two.
Yeah,
Right.
right. So, I mean, at one point, as the thing advances, he also talks about the problems where at one point there was no real unit yet. So, how do you value so and so much copper versus so and so much barley? And
Hmm.
then what about tomorrow? Is it going to be the same tomorrow? Do you have predictability? All these things. So, that's why the common currency, the shekel, was invented. And uh,
Fast
over
forward.
time,
Yeah.
yeah, a little fast forward. But, I wouldn't say that he has looked into MMT or anything like that. So some of his analysis has some neoclassical economic undertones, I would say, but I think it's still useful, big picture. He suggests that the fiat age began um, sometime around the time of the Spanish Empire. Or, sorry, no, that was silver. So they started using silver because they could mine so much silver in Peru, the Spaniards,
Hmm.
that they started flooding the world with silver, basically, and silver became a common currency.
And
And
most of it ended up in China. I don't know if you mentioned that.
I don't think so,
Yeah.
but yeah, we've talked about that. Um, but so 1971, then the U.S. goes off the gold standard. He says that was a big change because the because capital had become less scarce. And I think he's right about that because, as we've discussed, the gold standard forces the government to do austerity and forces a general reduction of production
The
below what would
the
be
liquidity
possible
is not
without it.
available for the general populace.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. It's not easy to get a loan. There's stricter criteria because the banks are forced to, the government is forced to reduce its deficits. And as we've discussed before, that's an arbitrary thing, right? It's a thing that Carol Quigley has also discussed this in Tragedy and Hope. The banking, the banking establishment has generally always been pro gold standard,
Right.
and because the gold standard forces lower inflation, forces lower deficits, lower inflation, and for a bank that makes fixed interest income, that's something they're paranoid about, inflation, because they don't want to
Right.
be
Deflation
inflated.
benefits the lender. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So then 1971, this changed. If there was a singular rule of finance in the area before 1971, it was that there was never enough money. Currency value was directly linked to some sort of asset, blah, blah, blah. So then came a new era of easy money, easy financing. And he starts by talking about the Asian financial model, interestingly. He says the Asian financial model was based on the notion that capital should serve politics, not the economy.
Hmm.
So you could achieve political goals by financing everything. And we've also discussed this when we talked about Professor Werner, because and actually Zeihan also mentioned this in this book here. The Japanese country, Japanese economy was obviously in shambles after World War II. Everything bombed to rubble. The debts on the banks, the debts on the balance sheets of the banks were all worth nothing, and then the Japanese central bank bought all these debts at par value,
Add
if
value.
I
Well,
remember.
like if the debt was for $1,000, they bought it for $1,000, not
Yeah,
five
as
hundred.
though they
Yeah.
could pay it back. So that that goes hand in hand with his analysis of the Asian financial model. The Chinese financial and the Japanese, they they have been more open to deficit spending and also just plain old bank lending, which is really just another form of government spending, especially in a country such as China, where
They control everything.
banks are state owned essentially. Yeah. Um, so that's the time of easy credit. Then he calls it the Great Conflation, the Euro model. The Europeans are more reserved than the Asians when it comes to finance, but that's a bit like saying Joanne Rivers didn't like plastic surgery as much as chair. So the Europeans are maybe a little more reserved. not fundamentally different in that regard at this point. Um, and then he goes into the American model, and also the Americans, obviously. The Americans are not exactly known for fiscal responsibility, right? So he says, don't make the mistake of thinking the Americans don't have that issue. But the Americans have a lot more to back it up, and they do have some advantages that the other countries don't have. Easy business formation, and obviously lots of natural resources, lots of geopolitical safety, all these things. But he says here, for example, something that did happen in America as a result of the post 1971 world, the world of more abundant capital, is that, well, I mean, just read it here. Exxon produced the crude oil in foreign. So the simple model pre 1971 capital scarcity. Exxon produced the crude oil in foreign countries. Exxon shipped the crude home via tankers. Exxon refined the crude into fuel at refineries it owned. Exxon distributed that fuel to retail stations. Exxon's network of franchisees sold the fuel to consumers. Post 1971, however, the laws of capital were, if not repealed, then certainly loosened. The new structure of capital supported risk-taking almost by default. New firms popped up to handle discrete tasks such as prospecting or transport or refining, rather than the full well-to-customer chain. These new firms swam alongside or even within the internal system of the major energy players. And then he starts talking about Enron, how Enron created basically the market for all these different suppliers to somehow be integrated with one another. And then Enron went nuts and started, doing all kinds of other things. And he also talks about, but then so the important point is this has enabled the U.S. to become energy independent, because all this entrepreneurship in the oil and the energy sector has led to the shale revolution, which has led to the fact that the U.S. can now supply all the oil and gas that it could possibly need. And so he says, yeah, while things have been done that were crazy and excessive, we still have all this knowledge and all the companies and the processes and the infrastructure in place to keep the lights on in our country. So then he gets to demographics and capital. So his big picture is basically that during the time when the baby boomers still were in their jobs, so they were mature workers. And mature workers are those workers who make more money than everyone else and who consume less than the younger workers.
Right, because they don't have kids anymore. They've already bought their house. They've already bought their cars,
Right.
etc.
Yeah. But their house, but their car, so the big ticket items they've already spent, they're accumulating money, and that money becomes available to put into the stock market.
Usually through their 401k programs or IRAs.
Right. So he's saying that is, in most parts of the world, that is going to go away because of the demographic decline, because these mature workers are going away. So there's not going to be so many people anymore who want to buy stocks with their 401ks, etc. Sorry, not for, because he also talks about how this will not be as big a problem in the U.S. because, number one, the U.S. has the largest millennial generation in the world. And as the millennials mature into higher earning jobs, etc., they will still be able to do this. Not as much as the baby boomers before, but at least the U.S. has that advantage. And
we
also
have somebody here to replace him, and most other countries.
Yes, and also
don't.
Interestingly, what he says about the U.S. is that the inequality in America is going to be a big advantage for us, because very rich people are less likely to do that thing that you said earlier, where they sell their stocks and buy treasuries and
go conservative with their finances.
Yeah, exactly. So in the U.S., because of inequality, because of this giant amount of cash that's sitting in the bank accounts of the 1%, they won't be impelled to that extent to sell their stocks. They can bear the volatility, because the reason why we're selling the stocks is when we're older is because we don't want the volatility. But to super wealthy, it doesn't really matter as much. They're still going to keep some money in the stock market.